Welcome, everyone. So let's see. First thought comes to my mind is that the natural language of the human soul is poetry. And one of the deepest powers of the human soul is imagination. And so in many ways, I'm going to be working from the language of the soul and trying to tap into the deep ancient imagination, which says that the human soul is not easily overwhelmed and knows how to survive when we feel most lost. I'm operating from that kind of old idea. And part of me wants to begin listing all the tragedies that are happening in the world right now, because I'm aware of many of them, as you probably are, and then just lament that. But the point of this session is really to imagine surviving the tragedies and the uncertainties. And so there'd be two parts to it. First part is the nature of uncertainty and its connection to big things that are happening now, like the potential for transformation. And then we'll go to the ideas and images about making more soul. So the old idea is that everybody has a unique soul. Nature only makes originals. And so everyone who is born has a unique soul. That's the old idea. That's what tells us that we have to respect everybody, because everyone has an original capacity. And that's what we want to respect. That's the depth of diversity, is the uniqueness of the individual human soul. But we're here not just to awaken to our soul, which is a great idea, but also to make more soul in the world. And one way you know that the world needs soul is when the world gets polarized and when there's lots of conflicts and there is no center and no shared sense of unity. What's missing is soul. Soul is the connective tissue of life. And when soul goes missing, everything divides and the world can turn against itself. And you could say that the great uncertainty with which we now live is part of that sad process of the world turning against itself. So part of the practice for me is beginning with poetry. And so this is a poem from William Stafford, who was a sweet man that I had the good fortune of working with. And he was a very quiet man. And he would write a poem every day. And then he would, like, as if he was an animal living close to the ground, he would hide them. And when people, after he passed, maybe 15 or 18 years ago, people wanted to gather all his poetry, and they couldn't even do it. There was poems hidden all over. And so this is one of the poems that he released or revealed. And it begins like this. Out in the mountains, nobody gives you anything. And you learn what the rules were after the game is over. And by then it's already night. And it doesn't make any difference what anyone else is thinking or doing, because now you have to turn into an Indian. You remember stories then, and you know that the tellers were part of all they told. And everyone else was also, even you. And when you're in that state, they're all around you. But if you're afraid, you will never find them. And those questions that people always ask, what would you do if? They have their own answer right now. Nothing. Listen, some things cannot be redeemed in a hurry, no matter how good the intentions are. What could be done had to have been done a long time ago, because mistakes have consequences that do not just disappear. Listen, if evil could simply be canceled, it would not be very evil. And so, the stars you see while you drift away, they have their own courses, and they watch you, and they already know your name. So he's taking on us on this journey of getting lost, and then being alone in the night, and then feeling, tremendous uncertainty and not knowing where to turn. And then he suggests in a way that we turn to the stories, because the stories involve everyone, even you. And then he goes into this great thing where he says, things had to have been done a long time ago. if we would have it to be different now. And that's what we're living through. Things that weren't done before, healings that didn't happen, peace agreements that weren't made or weren't kept, all kinds of things that happened. We're now living with the after effect of those things, you could say. And then at the end, he throws in this brilliant thing. I mean, poets are in the world to kind of translate between the unseen and the seen. And he pulls this thing out of the unseen where he says, in being lost, if you look at the stars and that old human instinct to connect to the enormous, sky of stars and the galaxy. And when you do that, you remember that. Even when you feel lost, the stars know your name. And that goes to this old idea I just mentioned about the nature of the soul. For instance, among certain tribes in Africa, they have the imagination that each unique soul secretly has a thread from their heart that ties them to a star in the galaxy. This is, before science and before premeditated thinking and all that. They just have this knowledge. They got it from looking at the sky. And so each person is secretly connected to a star somewhere in the galaxy. And then when a person dies, it's as if a star falls out of the sky. And not only are they lost, but the light that they were connected to is gone. Just another beautiful, soulful thing. And I'm trying to suggest through poetry to other things that soul, which is what makes each of us unique, is also the energy that connects us all together. And that if we're going to change the world, if we're going to heal things, if we're going to find unity again, if we're going to create genuine, humane society, which is inclusive and respectful, we're going to have to make more soul. So, to be alive at this time means to be present as many familiar patterns simply dissolve. There's a lack of consensus when it comes to science, an increase of polarization when it comes to almost any issue that arises, and a loss of trust in social institutions. The changes are happening so fast that the institutions that were created to protect us cannot keep up with what's going on. And as things cycle faster and faster, one major crisis quickly replaces another so that people's fear of change intensifies and both collective and personal levels of uncertainties grow day by day. It turns out that the fear of uncertainty, in other words, people become afraid of uncertainty. This is happening, especially just recently. That makes us surprisingly deeply vulnerable. Uncertainty turns out to be a powerful thing that can make us feel very vulnerable and more susceptible to intense levels of anxiety. And that's one reason I think why we're addressing it tonight. At the same time, uncertainty permeates the world. Uncertainty is not something that can be dismissed or be suspended or avoided. It actually makes its appearance in all kinds of things, including cosmology. Cosmology is the stories that people make up about the world. Cosmology is like, humans are the only cosmologists so far. The only ones thinking about how this whole cosmos may have come to be and what is it that sustains it. And so at the same time that uncertainty is permeating our daily lives and our individual psyches, it also makes an appearance at the level of cosmology because modern scientists who for many years had a consensus that the universe was expanding at an accelerating rate now are not so certain. They used to think that if nothing changed some billions of years from now, the universe would presumably become more separated, everything from each other in this rapid expansion or acceleration of expansion that they were studying. And then presumably everything would become distant and cold and dark and inhospitable. However, recent studies reveal that what scientists call dark energy is acting in ways that they did not anticipate. And the report that they put out starts out with this statement: the fate of the universe is still very much up in the air. In other words, their entire theory of the universe has now been thrown into uncertainty. And what I'm trying to point out is that this issue that we're dealing with, uncertainty at so many levels of life, actually extends into the cosmos or into people's current theories about the cosmos. And so the new data suggest that the process of cosmic and acceleration has actually been weakening for 4 or 5 million years. Their data was incorrect. What they thought was endless expansion actually has been weakening for millions of years already. And so dark energy, which they now think is at the center of everything, turns out to not be a cosmological constant, but rather it is changeable just like everything else in the cosmos. And they end the report by saying, we cannot foretell what dark energy will do in the future, so that the future of the cosmos is uncertain. So I'm not just trying to make the uncertainty worse. I'm trying to give it a place. I'm trying to look at where it exists in the very big things like the cosmos, and how we might imagine it differently so that it isn't simply something that is like persecuting us. So it turns out that in times of radical change, uncertainty that has been there all along gets revealed. That's another way of looking at it. And so we see it in this study of the cosmos. And of course, they're worried now that since it's the cosmos has not been simply, getting bigger and bigger as they thought. Now they're worried that it's going to contract and in that way disappear. But I think it doesn't take that much kind of imagination to realize that probably what happens is the cosmos expands and then it contracts. Because you could say the cosmos breathes. Nature breathes. You could say that when we're breathing in the entire cosmos, and when we're exhaling, we're releasing the cosmos. This whole thing is alive. It's all breathing. And I think they'll eventually get to that realization. Nature literally breathes, the trees and everything breathe, and we take in the oxygen they produce and so on. And people used to know, like Stafford is implying in the poem, that each person is secretly connected to the cosmos and that the stars know our name. There's no proof of that, but I'm trying to provide a sense of relocating ourselves in the cosmos and in the world, because part of the uncertainty has been caused by the dislocation of the human soul that used to be considered part of the soul of the world and now is considered to be isolated and separate and unmoored, and also accidental. So in a way, you could say the current ways that we view the world are part of what's blocking us finding the kind of imagination and ideas that could help us find a way through all the confusion, tragedy, uncertainty. And one of the ideas that is an ancient idea, but I find it valuable now, is that the world is not a finished place. Creation didn't happen back then, and we're in the aftermath. The world is unfinished, and creation is happening all the time. And the same is true of our lives. For our souls are here to transform and are always on the verge of awakening in both small and big ways, that not only connect us to the pulse of life, for instance, the heart of nature, but also make us potential assistants or agents that can help creation to continue. And this old idea about creation being ongoing is a bigger idea than the idea that the world might end. So I just realized I'm going to put out ideas and images and stories. And the idea isn't to agree with me or even capture everything. The idea is to see what strikes you. Because what strikes the soul gives us more of our connection, and the connections to the soul give us more of a sense of coherence, and a sense of coherence gives us a relief from the uncertainty that penetrates everything more and more. So maybe just to put a cap on it, the world becomes flooded with uncertainty and anxiety, and a greater psychological, spiritual, and cosmological understanding is needed in order not to be overwhelmed, in order not to be numbed or swallowed by the circumstances. And in this old understanding, the world, with all its conflicts, uncertainties, and insecurities, is also the place of redemption and renewal. And the soul, being connected to the soul of the world, is also our individual connection to the energies of redemption, you could call it. Not that big redemption that people said comes at the end, but the little redemptions that we could get now. But also there's a opportunity through the awakening of the soul to have a personal connection to the energies of renewal. We're not supposed to be the same person at the end of our life as we were coming in. We are supposed to be, with any kind of luck and grace, kind of like a revelation of the core energies and imagination that we brought into the world when we came in. So, back to the uncertainty. Entering the modern world at this time of global crises of all kinds can be like stepping into a rite of passage that's underway. And the reason I mention rite of passage is because the middle of a rite of passage, which is usually called liminality, one of its chief characteristics is uncertainty. A rite of passage has three parts to it. The beginning is a separation, when, like in the Stafford poem, the person winds up all alone at night. There's a separation that occurs. It happens all repeatedly in a person's life. When separation happens, the soul thinks we're on one of those journeys of awakening. And if the first step is being separate from other things, the second step is the step that puts us into ordeals and questions and uncertainty. And the old term for that is liminality, which means to be between one thing and another. And so that liminality would mean the betwixt and between, in which one state or phase of life transitions into another stage or phase of life. And you could say that's what's happening collectively. The world that we knew is gone. The world that we're headed for hasn't arrived yet. And we are in that betwixt and between liminal state. And that is part of the cause of the intensification of uncertainty, because in that kind of uncertainty is where the actual revelation of what's trying to happen occurs. The in-between, the betwixt and between, is where we don't know what's going to happen next, but we are actually closer to what's trying to happen. So that's the old way of understanding, rites of passage, and especially that central part, the liminality. And that's the part where we already are, collectively and therefore also personally. So in liminal conditions, we find aspects of ourselves and we see aspects of the world that were otherwise hidden. Imagine an individual going through a general rite of passage. At first, it usually happens in youth. And it used to happen to all girls and all boys in most traditional cultures. And at first you leave everyone you knew, your family, your parents, your community, and you're on like a vision quest, and you're in nature. And nature is connected to cosmos, and nature is constantly changing, and so is the cosmos. And so in that connection to those things that are naturally changing, the individual has a greater capacity for changing also, but that change process involves uncertainty and not knowing and letting go of who we thought we were in order to make room for the soul to awaken further and reveal who we already are at the core of ourself. That would be what would happen in the middle of a rite of passage. And I'm saying we're in a collective rite of passage where humanity has to let go of things that we thought were firm and sure, therefore the uncertainty about things. And in that letting go, the space is created for visions of the next world to come to those people who learn how to stand in the uncertainty and accept the position of not knowing. The only way to know something that we don't know is to stand in the place where we don't know. And we don't know now how to find the next world, or how to even imagine a world that is not simply better than this, but is actually more profoundly present than the world that we currently have. So just to repeat in a sense, the liminal condition of being betwixt and between, being uncertain and not knowing, is the place where humans become most aware of who we are. And there can be a remembering of how we are secretly connected to nature. Human nature is not separate from great nature. It's secretly connected to great nature. And once we realize that, it's not a big step to realize we are secretly connected to the cosmos. And following the poets, the cosmos already know our name. And when they say name, they don't mean literal name. They mean the name that echoes in our soul. So the liminal realm, or the liminal space, or the liminal time, is where a person can encounter the core mysteries of life. And the core mystery, according to the old traditions, is an open secret that keeps being forgotten. It is also the transformative pattern of life, and it used to be called the process of life, death, and renewal, or life, death, and rebirth. That's what happens in nature. That's what happens in the galaxy and in the cosmos, where the stars are born and they die, and more stars are born from that dying. And we are part of that. And the idea of transforming is living through that kind of process. And the more conscious we become of that, the less simply uncertain we are. It's not that we're certain, it's that we know we're in a process that can hold us and carry us and get us to the place where we are recognizing the name in our own soul, the calling in our own life, and the way we might be able to contribute to the renewal of the world. Because the old idea is the humans can damage the world, but if they have the capacity to damage the world, there also must be the capacity to help heal and renew the world. And if we don't understand that, then it looks like it's all going to hell. Once we understand it, we realize, oh, we're going to hell too, but that's okay. Hell is a descent into a dark place which is similar to the dark energy in the cosmos, and that's the place where life renews. A descent is necessary for things to arise again. So I'm just saying with different phrases a similar thing. So soul making, which I'm suggesting is part of the reason we're here, involves participating in the core mystery of life. That is to say, the letting go of existing structures and existing attitudes, a kind of death, you could say, that happens at the level of the soul that leads not to emptiness, but in fact to fullness and renewal. Soul making depends on dying in one way in order to live a greater way. And this is the old idea. It was the core notion of rites of passage. And rites of passage was always happened in nature. We're connected to nature and its magical, mysterious capacity to keep renewing. And so we have to find our way back to that, or we have to find our way into that, or we have to find our way down to that, because it's in us, just in our nature, just the way it's in great nature. And so, although disconcerting and disorienting, a liminal phase can also be seen as the realm of pure possibility, where novel ideas and new relationships can arise. We need novel ideas to replace the outworn ideas that are from which the current institutions and worldviews come from. Well, the novel ideas and even the potential new relationships can't be found by having committee meetings with all the lights on. They're found by descending into the darkness, which is connected to the dark energy, which is the changeable form at the core of the universe. So, although the future of humanity and the planet itself has become increasingly uncertain, when we see it as liminal space and liminal time, it becomes the precise time for transformation. And transformation means to move from one form to another. And that big energy and that big experience of moving from one form, the world as it used to be, to another, the world as it's trying to become, that's what we're part of now. And that's what's affecting all, you could say, all the levels of life. And so when, I'm here in America, and we currently have a president who has really wild ideas that are not part of soul making. As a matter of fact, they tend to be destructive to the soul and to the lives of many people. And so when he decides to have a trade war, one person, one disturbed, deranged psyche makes a decision, and within 48 hours, the entire system of trade and financial connections in the world is thrown into uncertainty. That's how close it is. And it's closer now because of this bigger change that's going on. But if one psyche can do that, then I'm suggesting then any number of individual psyches can also enter that uncertainty, recognize the liminal quality, find the things that are trying to awaken. And, they used to say that the knowledge is endlessly available in the universe, and it's trying to enter the world all the time, and it can only come into the world to the souls living at that time. If we imagine we're in this liminal space where change and transformation is really what's trying to happen, we can become part of receiving forgotten knowledge and missing knowledge, which is needed to reimagine how we relate to each other, how humanity relates to nature, and how we begin to form and contribute to the redeeming and the renewal of the world. That's the big idea stuff I'm trying to present as an antidote to the current rattling of the world and the increasing uncertainty and anxiety that penetrates our lives. So in rites of passage, the liminal stage of necessity involves a descent into darkness, because what's missing from the daylight world has to be found in the darkness. And so in the modern world, there is no formal rite of passage anymore. And so people are left on their own, left to their own devices, which are now, of course, literal devices that seem to connect everybody to each other, but it's a horizontal connection, and it lacks the vertical imagination that holds the real world together. But people have come to fear descent, when descent is the way of the soul from the beginning. The soul inside the one trying to be born has to descend from the womb. It falls with gravity into the world. Descent is the motion of the soul from the beginning. And when the soul wants to grow, it descends in order to collect things that are deep. The soul is about depth. It's about connections and relations through a depth of knowing and a depth of feeling and a depth of caring. And so descent is the way of the soul. So this was well known. And people also knew that the important ideas about human life and about the nature of the world and about the cosmos and about all the interconnections constantly are being lost. And so there were many stories about how to reconnect and recall what's really going on, and possibly even gain insight into why we keep forgetting, keep losing the things we most need. And in Sufi stories, which I'm about to tell one of, which are kind of teaching stories. One of the main characters is the Mullah Nasruddin, who sometimes appears as a wise sage, but at other times plays the fool. And in that sense, he represents the notion that we each have access to wisdom, and yet we each can be foolish in our own particular ways. And so in this one little story, what happens is Nasruddin, turns out he's out late one night, like the middle of the night, like he was at the tavern, and now he's on his way home. And then when he gets near his house, he realizes he doesn't have the key, the single only key into his house. And so he begins looking for the key that must have been dropped somewhere. And he's down on his hands and knees in the middle of the night in the circle created by an old gas lamp that's there in the street. And he's down there looking around, and then along comes a friend, a neighbor, who sees him down there, and he says, "Mullah, what's happened? Have you lost something? Why you're down on the ground on your hands and knees? And Nasruddin says, well, I lost the only key to my house and I can't get in. And so the friend gets down with him, and the two of them down on their hands and knees in this light being created by this old gas lamp. And after a while, the neighbor gets tired, saying, this isn't going anywhere. He says, Nasruddin, are you sure you dropped the key here where the lamplight is shining? And Nasruddin says, no, I dropped it somewhere over there in the darkness. And the friend says, well, why are we looking here in the light? And Nasruddin says, well, the light is where you find things. No? And the friend is confused, and the story ends there. And the idea is that most people are looking for the lost things in the light. The whole Enlightenment was like looking for lost things in the light. And what we're looking for is in the dark. The key that we need to open the door to the future that we want to have is not found in the light, it's found in the dark. And we have to do something about our Nasruddin nature, or the tendency to keep looking in the light for what's been lost, because what's been lost falls where most things began, back into the darkness. So, as the holy fool, Nasruddin represents our own fears and confusion when we find ourselves faced with the great need to change our lives radically. Nasruddin knows that the lost key must be in the darkness, but he also wants to avoid facing those inner fears and inner conflicts. And this is what uncertainty and, disruption do to us. It puts us in this state where we have to face our fears and the inner conflicts, which everybody has, no matter what they say. And that's a fearful thing to do. And so people keep having committees that meet in the light of day or well-lit rooms. And what they tend to do is kick the trouble down the road back into the darkness, and continually don't find the key that can unlock the situation in such a way that people find a renewed sense of self and a renewed connection to each other. And so the human habit of avoiding dark places and deep issues develops at a collective level as well. And so the issue ultimately is not that we're empty inside, although a lot of modern people believe that. The old idea is that everyone has latent talent, what used to be called the latent code or the inner code, that can open the doors to psychological growth and spiritual awakening. But when people don't know that exists inside of them, then everybody goes looking in the outer world and in the brighter world for the things that can only be found by looking within. And so just as the poem said, that in the middle of the night we have to find that something else that is the only answer for us. Native American traditions, they say everyone is born with the medicine that they most need inside themselves. The problem is people refuse to look in the only place where it can be found. You could even say that a person who goes on a pilgrimage is going to a sacred center or a naturally beautiful place, and it's worth traveling there. But the real pilgrimage is moving to the center of the soul. And the accomplishment isn't arriving at the destination. The accomplishment is arriving at the center of one's own soul. The real pilgrimage is a pilgrimage inside. And some people say the longest journey or the longest pilgrimage is from the mind to the heart, which is part of that inner journey. And they say that when a person truly changes, it's not just a change of mind, but also a change of heart that rearranges the kind of psychic internal structure so that a person is more consciously aware of who they already are inside. And I'm going to repeat that idea a few different ways. We come into the world not empty. We come into the world with some core imagination, some inner sense of self, and with an aim in life. So this is a distinction between the modern idea that humans are part of an accidental universe and don't necessarily have anything inside, and what's there is more or less created by family and community and experiences in life. The old stories in all traditions was that each soul comes in with gifts that are seated inside, with a purpose and sense of aim that's already present. And it's just that we forget that when we're born. And then we have to find it again. And according to so many old stories, it's when we encounter obstacles and defeats, when we fall into darkness and we slip off the path, we are actually closer to that thing we're trying to find if we could just allow ourselves to be in that position, because that's when the soul can transform and grow. So there's an inner arc of transformation that our souls would have us follow. Yes, it goes out into the world to some degree, but eventually it really goes to where it wants to go. The transformation arc leads inside. But there's also a counter arc. There's a counter energy inside the person that obscures that arc. It's like when Nasruddin is looking in the light when he should be in the dark. We have a part of us that doesn't want to go there. We have a part of us that is opposed to our own natural growth and transformation. Otherwise, most people would be there. Recently, I've been studying the biology of the caterpillar turning into the butterfly, the metamorphosis, the transformation. And the recent studies revealed that inside the cocoon, which is the place of this descent for the caterpillar, it descends into the darkness of the cocoon where it kind of decomposes like in an alchemical process of dissolution. And that has to happen before the cells of the butterfly can awaken. And those cells, strangely, have been named the imaginal cells, as if the scientists caught on to the underlying mystery of life for a minute or so. And what happens inside the darkness there is actually a battle between the cells of the caterpillar and the latent cells of the butterfly. And at first they couldn't understand, why would the cells of the caterpillar try to destroy the cells of the butterfly that's trying to come out of the same cocoon? And it was only after they studied carefully they realized that the resistance of the cells of the caterpillar to the awakening and the presence and the growth of the butterfly are necessary for the butterfly cells to gain enough strength to be able to grow and break out of the cocoon. What I'm trying to say is, even though Nasruddin wouldn't acknowledge it, what happens when we descend and accept the darkness that we're going to be in anyway, what happens is our own resistance, the inner arc against our transformation, is awakened. And that resistance, like the uncertainty, is not something we can simply dispose of. In a sense, our resistance is there to intensify the process of awakening and transformation. And we have to tolerate the resistance, accept that that's part of what's happening, in order for enough of the awakening of our own interior imaginal cells to happen. So that's part of what I see in that story. And one other thing to add to the story, they're just little stories, but you can keep opening them up. And the old idea was the teaching stories have levels, below levels, below levels. And so inside this story of the lost key, with its reference to a latent code, latent things that are, latent means it's there, but it hasn't awakened yet. And the suggestion is everybody has latent talents inside them. It's the gift of nature. And so the word latent and talent are actually connected. They're the same letters. And if you just change two of the letters, you go from latent to talent. So the idea is that inside each person are natural gifts and talents, which give kind of shape and direction to the soul. And those talents are intended to be given. It's in giving the talents that we become conscious of what they are and learn how to live with them. But given the construction of the cosmos and the way of the world, the talents are latent to begin with. It's interesting also that the word talent which is a reference, it's an old German word, the roots of which take you to the idea of the weight used to measure gold. So the talents, the gifts of a person, you could say, are the inner gold. But those talents, if they're not found, made conscious, and expressed, become like a weight. So we each have talents. We're here to become conscious of those talents, and we're here to engage with the world by giving our talents and then receiving what the world has to give to us. If we don't do that, it is in a state of neutrality. The latency leads to the talents to become a weight. And for some people, a depression is really the weight on the soul of talents that have not become conscious and are not being used and are not being given. So you could say the key that unlocks the door to the psychic house also unlocks the latent talents of the soul. And when we are able to be connected to our natural gifts and talents, we are not so easily thrown off balance and knocked off the path by uncertainty or obstacles or challenges. And you could also say that when we are in the face of uncertainty, obstacles, and challenges, we are actually closer to finding the key that unlocks the puzzle of the psychic house, and therefore we are closer to our own latent talents. And when we feel the presence of those talents, we are not simply a lost soul, we are actually a soul finding its own way, because the old way is what is inside, is what is intended to awaken and come out and lead us. And a calling in life is calling to the latent talents in the soul. And when a person responds to the calling, they find themselves with an orientation and a direction in life. And when we're following our natural direction in life, we actually not only feel less uncertain in ourselves, but we have something to give to the world. And when the world finds itself into current dark, uncertain, and distorted condition that it's in, it doesn't need one idea or one belief or one political party or one new religion to solve it. It needs many people awakening to the nature of their own souls and figuring out how to bring that inner nature out into the world. And then, without everybody having to agree, things begin to change. The old idea is what changes the soul changes the world, and no one can prove it. But I'm finding that to be a kind of encouraging idea in the midst of the darkness and confusion and all the certain uncertainty in the world. And so maybe I'll stop there. I see there are questions. I have entered a liminal passage in my life, but do not yet have the form or hope of what comes next. I wonder how you see faith playing into such a transformation. I worry that I'm wishing this is a deeper transformation than it might be, and that I might just be the caterpillar dreaming of becoming a butterfly more than truly being in the process of becoming. Thank you. So the concern about being the caterpillar just dreaming and not the butterfly, that's part of the uncertainty being generated. And as far as faith, and I'm assuming it means faith in some existing belief system or something, I think that can be helpful. It also can be limiting, because the core thing here is that while we're looking for what we know that we need in order to feel genuine and meaningful and purposeful and even present, is actually in us. And so you could say that a faith or a belief system is like a beginner's learning wheels, and it gets us going. But eventually we hit those places where, and I think this is true for all the great and wondrous people that we respect, all the ones who founded religions and philosophies. The reason we know them as founders is because they found a place where they had to find something within them that was missing. And so when we can follow one of these great founders and spiritual leaders, but eventually we hit what's called the pathless path, or the place where we have to go down inside and find that missing key. And My sense of faith comes from the idea that each soul has that inner code, that latent talent, that waiting to awaken calling, that purpose, that meaning. Purpose isn't something we find outside. Purpose exists from our heart from before we're born. What we're trying to do is shatter the things that keep us from getting that deeply connected and conscious of our own being. When we do that, we then find the way. And so I don't know, at some point we have to trust that the caterpillar part of us, although it's going to resist, is actually resisting the thing that we're intended to become. For me, I use poetry and stories. When I start to feel really uncertain, I go back to poems and I go back to stories and I go back to songs for that matter, to be in touch with the harmony within, to be in touch with the sense of creativity that comes from being near the core of one's own soul. Is the liminal similar to the bardo? Is there an archetype connected to this space? Yes, thank you. Good question. What's called the bardo in Buddhist traditions and so on is actually very similar to the liminal. And just as the bardo can be a period of descent and being lost in life, the bardo can also be a life after death. And that's the same as the archetypal stuff about liminality and rites of passage, that there is a little death. So the old idea is that you hear it in all kinds of statements. Rumi says it. He says, die before you die. And then you say, what are you talking about? That sounds confusing. But what it means is we go through little deaths before we ever get to big death. And what happens in the little deaths, in the bardo stages, what happens is something of our ego or little self dies. Our little self is the part that's staying out under the light, pretending it's looking for the key when it knows that it actually has to go to the dark. So that's the ego or the little self that's so afraid. It pretends it's in charge, but it's really afraid. And so it stays under the light and doesn't go into the dark. And so that which can transform within us has to be connected to bardo or limited or liminal phases, because that's the only way that change can occur. I hope that makes sense. I'm suggesting that it's there at the biological level, that it's there at the level of nature, and that it's there at the level of the individual, and it's there at the level of the cosmos. And so I know that bardo in certain texts describe it as a very specific way, but I think bardo is like a purgatory during life as well as a state that apparently can occur after life. How does one know when they are properly standing in the liminality? Is this a sense of compassion and peace in the midst of uncertainty? Well, first of all, we know we're in liminality when we don't know where to turn. When we admit, I don't know. That, and by the way, that's the ego, right? The ego part of us. You need enough ego to move around. And the ego is helpful because it knows where the car keys are and things like that. But when change is occurring, the ego is the part that's resistant, like the caterpillar cells. And so then what has to happen? The ego has to let go at least enough. And part of the faith, I guess, or the trust would be when the ego or the little self realizes there is a greater self and soul. And so in liminality, there's a letting go that has to happen. And it's the ego that has to let go. And that's why rites of passage are either happen out in the wilderness, where a person is exposed to the intensity of nature, to animals and storms and all kinds of things that can happen. And if you accept that you're there and you're not going to run away, then what happens? The ego lets go. The little self lets go. And that letting go creates a couple of things. An intensity of uncertainty and not knowing, but also the possibility of fully waking up. And so how do you know when you're properly in the liminality is when you are uncertain and don't know. One of the biggest challenges to the modern world and modern humanity is the realization that we do not know. that our knowledge is limited, and the only way our knowledge grows is by accepting that we don't know. And it's that ego, little self, that has to let go in the individual case. And so is this a sense of compassion and peace in the midst of uncertainty? It certainly can be that. When a person lets go, you can have the uncertainty intensify. And then if you keep letting go, then the next thing you can realize that you don't fall into oblivion, you fall into the depth of the soul. And when that kind of compassion, actually, you could say, is a compassion for oneself. Because until we let go of that which we're clinging to so desperately, we're not being compassionate to ourselves. And compassion, when a person has it, has to begin with the self. And then in there, yes, there can be a sense of peace. If you figure out that the deep self is the place, the central place in the psyche, self and soul, I use them interchangeably, but it's the center of the psyche, and therefore it is a place of centering and grounding, and it can be a place of peace. But strangely, the center is also the beginning, so that same center, which can be in a moment or more, it can give a sense of peace and settling. That same energy is the energy of beginning, like beginner's mind, and it's also the source of creativity. So when we find that place, it's not simply defined by one thing. It can have a quality of peace and centering and letting go of anxiety. You could say anxiety is the distance between the little self and the deep self. So when we let go, the little self lets go enough, we can let go of anxiety and settle into that security of the natural center of the soul. And then when we find ourselves there, we also find ourselves at the source of creative energy and imagination. And so then you have the choice of finding peace and staying with the peace, and or connecting to the threads of imagination and the calling that's natural to that self and soul, and then going from there out into the world with the sense of calling and the sense of imagination and the sense of purpose and the sense of meaning, which is lacking pretty much all the time in the daily world. If the majority of people are caught in the endless loop of subsistence and routine, how can the deeper call of the soul be heard, let alone be answered? What allows for awakening in a world that demands constant doing? Well, what allows for it is we get stopped. What usually causes a person to transform or have the potential to transform is we get stopped on the road. Something stops us. It can be a sickness, or the loss of a loved one. It can be the loss of a relationship. It can be the beginning of a relationship. It can be a disaster. It can be, a windfall. Something happens and the ego cannot handle it, cannot claim it. It knows that it didn't do it, or it thinks it can't handle it. And so then we're in that place. They say that, each soul needs an outer drama in order to awaken. What's going on now is the outer drama is 24/7. It's happening all the time, and it's coming from all directions. Nature is radically changing just as culture is radically collapsing. It's a very rare time to be alive. It's a challenging time, it's a disturbing time, it's a disruptive time, and it is also, from the view of the soul, the precise time for transformation, for awakening, and for changing from within. And just to repeat, I'm going with the old idea that what changes the soul changes the world, and you get back to the idea that of people who are caught in the endless loop of subsistence and routine. What happens is when enough people start to awaken, the people in the routine start to notice. And maybe one of them is a friend, and they say, "What happened to you?" And they say, "Well, I awakened from the inside. It was really weird. I didn't think it could possibly happen. And now I have a better idea of what I'm doing." And what happens is, soul to soul, there is a gathering transformation that changes the collective worldview. That's what the stories say. You can't prove it. And where does suicidal ideation fit into all of this? Is it a manifestation of the resistance to renewal and transformation? Really good question. Thank you. So when the world is falling apart, when the systems that hold everybody together, the institutions and the familiar patterns are rattling and unraveling, what happens is pressure comes down on everybody, and pressure comes down on, especially on those people who were on the edge. And a person who would have lived on the edge maybe the rest of their life can be put right over the edge because of pressure coming down from all of the things that are rattling and unraveling in the world. I'm serious. We are feeling the weight of an uncertainty that has been revealed that was there all along, but it's intensified. And we are feeling the weight of the world on our individual souls. And so there's a greater tendency for suicidal ideation. From the view of the soul, the idea of thinking about death is related to the idea of initiation. And so some people commit suicide because they got completely lost and so on. There's lots of reasons. And strangely, some people will commit suicide right after they've accomplished something. It's very strange how it happens. But the basic idea is our soul understands that we have to die in order to be reborn. And the problem, especially with young people and suicide, but with many people, is they confuse the idea that they need to die with the insight that something in them needs to die. That's the distinction I would make. When I've worked with suicidal groups and groups of young people recovering from the suicide of a friend and all, one of the big distinctions is, and you can say this directly to something, yes, something in you needs to die, but just not you entirely. And what you could say is that kind of suicidal thought or hints that I might die or maybe I should die is actually, if it were to be understood, the beginning separating phase of the rite of passage. In other words, from the soul's point of view, like Rumi says, die before you die. The Irish proverb says death is the middle of a long life. And what they mean is we allow those things that are no longer alive within us to die. We then enter that transformation through which we find a bigger life. And unfortunately, in the modern world, when the whole notion of the soul is absent, people take things literally, and people simply sometimes die because they took literally what was really a soulful instinct to let some part of them die so that a deeper, richer part of them could awaken and grow. I hope that helps with that. That's true of a cultural, the sense of a society or a culture. It's not that people nowadays will say maybe nature is finished with the experiment with humanity. That's an image and an idea that is lacks imagination. Nature thinks not that we're finished with them, but they need to be finished with certain things that limited their sense of being alive. And the idea is not that nature is going to be finished with humanity. Humanity is one of the links in the chain of being. You don't want to break that chain. Nature doesn't want to break that chain. Nature, I think, people used to read the text of nature, and the text of nature is saying it's not that humanity needs to die. It needs to let go of inhumane attitudes and things that are no longer alive in order to find the deeper values of humanity that have been forgotten and mostly lost, that are waiting to be found again. That's what I would say. I'm curious about illnesses at the time of liminality like now. Immune system illnesses are really apparent, from cancer to autoimmune to digestive ruptures, and are connected to mental health. Are you seeing a pattern? Yes. The whole immune thing is similar to the idea of the butterfly, the caterpillar and the butterfly. And the whole immune thing can be shifted and looked at in a much, much bigger way. If you imagine that it's all one interconnected thing, which is one of the oldest ideas which is being rediscovered, then you could imagine that the whole thing can get sick, and there can be a breakdown of those things that are protective of human societies. And that is especially true when human cultures are considered to be separate from nature. There's a deep connection that when it's lost, we lose psychic immunity as well as biological immunity, I would say. So yeah, I think you're onto something there. All right. I'm going to go on for a bit, and then we'll come back to questions. So I love that little story of Nasruddin having lost the key, and even allowing or, kind of tricking his friend into looking in the light when he knows it's in the dark. And I love all kinds of stories about transformation. And so this is one that is not like a folktale or a myth. This is a real story or a historical story, or maybe it's a folktale or a myth. Oh, okay, it's called The Drowned Book, and it's about Rumi, the great poet who I read his poems and recite to myself his poems all the time. And Rumi was born supposedly in 1207, but he remains to this day one of the great teachers of the ability of the human soul to transform and of the capacity of the human spirit to endlessly create. Again, I'll repeat, creation isn't something that happened a long time ago and now we're in the aftermath of it. Creation is something that's happening all the time, and we are invited to be part of it. And it's not that everyone is a great poet or a great musician, it's that everyone has creative capacity that is unique to them, and that is the saving grace inside the soul, and that is what we have to contribute to the world when it needs also to find a saving grace. But the transformative moment in Rumi's life came supposedly in 1244, when he met a wandering mystic who was known as Shams, or Shams of Tabriz. At the time, Rumi was about 37. He was a traditional Muslim preacher and scholar who had been trained primarily by his father, who had been trained by his grandfather. He was in a line of preachers and mystical teachers. And as the story goes, he was in Konya, and he was at a fountain. He was sitting on the edge or the ledge of a fountain, and he was talking and speaking and teaching a group of students in the open air. And he was using the book he had received from his father. His father was this great teacher, a renowned teacher, and his father had written down all kinds of things. And Rumi had inherited this original handwritten, handmade book. It was the only copy. Well, there were no copies. It was just that book. And he was using it as his script, following in his father's footsteps, following in the footsteps of the old Sufi teachers, and using it to teach other people, and sitting on the edge of the fountain while he was doing it. And then Shams appears and proceeds to knock the precious book off the ledge of the fountain and into the water. Rumi, in shock, says, "Why are you doing this?" And he protests that this is the only existing manuscript of his father's essential and definitive teachings. It's irreplaceable, he's saying. And Shams answers him saying, "It's time for you to live what you have been studying and talking about. It is time for you to live from inside yourself. But in the meantime, if your concern for this book is important to you, we can retrieve it and will be perfectly dry." And they take the book out of the fountain, and sure enough, it's dry and it's undamaged. And that changes Rumi's life. At that point, he becomes the mystical poet and the person we kind of know through his poems. After 3 years or so, Shams disappeared, and that's a whole other story. But in the meantime, Rumi has become the poet that we know him to be. And for the next 20 plus years, he writes poetry. We say he writes it. He used to recite it and other people wrote it down. But he also incorporates music and dance into his practice and into his teachings. He invents what we call the whirling dervishes. And he himself would whirl and spin and meditate inside that whirling and compose poetry, they say, but it actually simply arose in him and it would pour out of him and people would write it down as he was whirling and falling down. This is some of the stories about him finding the key to unlock this inner treasury of his genius, of his amazing gifts, and then of him giving them so profusely and generously to the world that we are still benefiting from them. And inside that is this old idea: the gifts we are given and that we are born with are intended to be given. And the more we hold on to them, the more they become a weight in us. And the more we give to them, they don't run out. They actually become more proficient or greater. And so the gift of awakening involves the learning to give the gifts that we find within ourselves. So I just love this story where the book that he was using has to disappear. It has to go into the darkness or into the dark water of the well in order for him to realize who he already is at his core. He has that teacher, Shams, who sees him, not what he's trying to do, but who he actually is. And part of what we need in our lives is to be seen by other people. You know, most of the troubles with young people come from not being seen and not being heard. And I don't mean heard just talking, heard when they're speaking about who they are. And you could say that the essence of therapy is when a person finds a therapist or a teacher who can meet the soul and the self that's in them. I hope I'm making sense. There's lots of good things about therapy, but the most amazing thing is when the soul of the therapist recognizes and somehow contacts and stimulates the soul of the so-called patient, who is also the seeker. And that's this little exchange or big exchange that happens between Rumi and Shams. And then, as in the story of Rumi, it doesn't mean then you're connected and go together down, for the rest of life. Sometimes those teachers come into our lives and then they're gone. And our job is to awaken as fully as we can. And again, there's a natural resistance like the cells of the caterpillar. There's a part of us that, as near as I can tell, is part of the ego or the little self that says, I can't do that. I can't handle this. I can't be that big. And then at the same time, we complain about something in the world. The old stories tried to keep reminding us the soul is here to transform. We are here to awaken. What we're looking for is inside ourselves, waiting to become conscious. And when that happens, we don't need the books that may have been helpful until we got to that point, but we no longer need them as much as we need to find a way to express the words written on our souls. I hope that makes sense, because those are the kind of times we live in. This is a hard time to be alive. It's a dark time to be alive. But from the view of the soul, from the point of growing soul, making soul, contributing soul to the world, this is the ideal or precise time for transforming. And just as much as we can be overwhelmed by the darkness and the uncertainty and the tragedies, we can also be closer to that inner spark, which most people, including Rumi, would call a spark of the divine, which some people call a speck of the original stars that made the galaxy. That spark of life inside us is an image or a symbol of some light inside the darkness, of some knowledge inside the confusion, as some essence of self inside the tremblings of the ego or the little self. So Rumi was there, perched on the edge. He didn't realize it completely, apparently. He was on the edge of awakening, but he needed to be pushed over that edge and off the map of the book he was using, past the point of no return. That's what happened when the book was gone. It seemed like it was gone forever. Everything he knew, the map of the world, the map of the soul his father had handed him, I guess, that was gone. And for a moment, where was he? In tremendous uncertainty, and yet that was the beginning of him awakening to what was written inside him and awakening to the calling that he had, which was so profound that, 10 years ago, Rumi was the most popular poet in the United States. He'd been gone since, 12 something. Some things are so connected to the divine and the eternal that they remain connected like a light. And certainly he has been that for me and many people I know. I used to recite those poems and carry those poems, and I still do. And when the world gets dark and everything seems uncertain again, poetry is the natural language of the soul, and all of the arts are part of the creative expression of the deep self and deep soul, and everyone has a connection to it and a part in it. And it becomes way more important when everything around us is falling apart. So there's another element to this. So in that story, it's a mystical story. It's a story from the Sufi tradition. And it's a story about knowledge being passed from teacher to student in ways that are dramatic and transcendent. And that's beautiful stuff and really meaningful. And to me, it's a kind of a soulful map to hold on to and experiment with. But there's another way of looking at the whole thing. And so I'm now going further into the idea of how we survive all this by growing our own souls. And so the stories and the ideas can come from many directions. So this is more of a contemporary idea. Actually, it starts with the alchemists. So in the Western world, where mysticism, for the most part, disappeared, the threads of it can be found in the traditions of alchemy. And alchemy was about turning lead into gold. And people argue about, the foolishness of that because you can't do it. But once you get the metaphor, you realize it's like turning the lead inside a person into the gold of their soul. And so you can get a sense of it as a metaphorical, mystical tradition. And in that tradition was the idea that we're not alone. And then Carl Jung is particularly effective in the modern world of translating the ancient texts and also the scripts of alchemy into a psychology of the deep self. And so the idea is, at the times when everything's falling apart or everything's closing in on us, the calling of our soul is actually closer. And not just that, but we are not alone. We are actually close to the source of energy and imagination and creativity that is called archetypal. Or you could say certain archetypes are trying to support us and contribute to our awakening and contribute to our creativity. So we may feel isolated, but we're not actually alone. We can be inspired and empowered by the archetypal energies of the soul, which also respond to the crises in our lives and the crises in the world. I want to be clear on it. I'm saying there is something that can be seen through the mystical stories and through the mythical stories, but also through this kind of depth psychology that says that when you go deep down inside, it is not emptiness that you find. You may hit a level of emptiness, but if you persist, you begin to find things that are deep resources that exist partially as personal aspects of the unique soul of the person, but then what Jung calls the collective unconscious is the source of the archetypes that are trying to enter the world through those people that are living. And so at this kind of period, when everything's falling apart, one of the ancient Greek terms for that is apocalypse, which doesn't mean fiery end. It means things collapse to renew. Apocalypse, the old meaning of it is collapse, renewal. And the energy for the renewal is coming from archetypal forces that exist unseen, unrecorded by modern science, but considered to be present in the ancient depths of the soul. And at a time like this, apocalyptic time. A lot of people think it's that. I think that's true if you understand what apocalypse means. The beginning of apocalypse is collapse, and then it moves into renewal, which in the Greek language is called apocastasis. So it doesn't end with apocalypse, it moves to apocastasis, which means collapse or life, death, renewal, life, death, rebirth. These are the old ideas that have been forgotten. And I think they try to come back in various ways. And one of the interesting ideas is that the archetypal energies, the archetypes are moving, just like those plates that are underneath the earth that shift. The archetypes also shift. And when things on the outside are falling apart, two of the key archetypes that become activated are the archetype of the deep self, which is what I was referring to as the center, and then also the archetype of creativity, which I was suggesting comes from the center. And so I hope this is helpful. To me, it really is. Archetypes are transformative energies that have the potential to change our lives from the inside. And in the two that you could say are particularly activated are this archetype of the deep self, which gives us the sense of center, which is the antidote to the winds and storms of uncertainty and chaos. But it doesn't stop there, because the center is also the beginning. So the other archetypal energy trying to enter the world through us is the archetype of creation. And again, creation wasn't something in the past, it's present all the time. And that creative energy gets more intensive, not after the collapse, but during the collapse. And so if you go back to the liminality in the middle of a transformative rite of passage or initiation experience or life experience, that there is the uncertainty and there is the letting go and the kind of cracking of the shell of the little self and the shattering of the patterns of the little self. And as that's happening, there's also the awakening of the deeper self and the deeper soul trying to become conscious. And according to these old alchemical psychological ideas, that also involves the deep archetypes. The word archetype has two parts. Arche means ancient and original, and type means form or force. And so these are the original shapes and forms and forces that make all of life. And because the human soul is connected to the soul of the world and kind of interwoven with all of life, we're in this strange position of having access to these archetypal forces that both center and create things, make things whole and make things renewable. We are in that position, and those things become more important, but also more possible when everything else is falling apart. And maybe to add one more thing to that, when a person awakens to what is in there, what I call who they already are, at the core and center of themselves, they become more authentic. That until we are in touch with the core of ourselves, we can be more inauthentic. And nowadays you can see that inauthentic people often wind up in the positions of power. That's part of what happens when things are kind of going upside down and so on. And so authentic is another Greek word. Ortho means like author. So the ortho part of our deep self and soul is the author, the writer, the creator, the singer, the songer, the lover. All of those things are part of the ortho part. And entic means something like the ground of being. And so again, our souls are trying to transform, not in some way shaped by an outer book or a pattern or a collection of ideas that were given to us, but from an inside that has its own author, its own instinctive creative sense, and also its own depth and state of being, which is connected to the center or the deep self or soul. So I'm saying in a kind of strange and radical way that the answer to the uncertainty in the world is making more soul by letting go of those things that limit us and hold us back, psychologically, those things that saved us early in life become the things that could kill us in later life. Humans are the most adaptive of all animals, as they say, and we're the most dependent when we're born. And we have to adapt to the family into which we were born. And when we're born, we have forgotten why we came. That's part of what happens when you move from the unseen world, the eternal world, into the world bound by time and space. We forget why we came. And our family doesn't know either. And so we adapt. We think we're empty inside, or we might think that, and we adapt to the family and the community and the society and all those kind of things. And if we hold on to those in the wrong way or too long, they block us from realizing what we really came here to do and who we already are inside. Our adaptations are meaningful and they can save our life early on, but if we cling to them, they become the obstacles that can keep us from growing and having the life that we're longing for. So, you could say there's two agreements in the soul. This is the way I got to it. That we have this original agreement, which was made before we were born. There's lots of old stories about it, how the soul agrees and connects to the idea of living a certain life. In certain stories, it's called connecting to the genius that's trying to be born with us. And when we're born, we forget that we were connected to that. That's what a lot of the longing for paradise is about. We forget we had that connection. And then our families don't know why we're here. The idea that we are the result of the DNA of our parents is an extremely limited idea. The soul has its own reason for being, and the family's not part of that. And of course, that's played out all the time. In order to grow and become ourselves after childhood, we usually have to leave home. We have to get out of the nest or the prison of the family, and we have to get into that liminal experience in the outer world in order to find out who we actually are. And that finding out is reconnecting to the original agreement. And so rites of passage, transformational experiences, if we go back to Rumi on the edge of the fountain, he wasn't going to let go of the received stuff from his father, which was valuable in its own way, but it was blocking him from the revelation coming from within. He needed help to let go of it. And the rest of us are like that too. I'm not saying we're all going to turn out like Rumi, but we all could turn out like ourselves. And who was the poet that said, "Be yourself, everyone else is taken"? Oscar Wilde said that. That's a core idea. And it's a challenge to become oneself. And then what happens is once we get a taste of it, get a feel for it, what happens is there's a whole bunch of what I call second agreements, were the agreements we made after we were born, the agreements with our family, the agreements with our educational process, the agreements with the neighbors, the agreements with the political system, all that kind of stuff, which can be valuable in certain ways, becomes in the way of the growth of the deep soul within us. And so it becomes a process of renegotiating the second agreements in order to get closer to the original agreement, which is the part that is going to give us genuine security because it connects us to the center of ourselves and it connects us to our capacity to change and create and to shift and to grow. And so here we are in the midst of all the uncertainty, and what's adding to the sense of impossibility or overwhelm often turns out to be what I'm calling second agreements. Let's see, how do we unpack that? Well, when a child leaves home, it has to, and often that happens in very tense and ways with lots of friction. There's something about the family and the parents and the home that's trying to hold on to the child, and there's something in the child that's hesitant to go. But the going then usually requires acting differently, getting out, experimenting. And then the parents are left in the empty nest, as it's called, and the parents have to renegotiate. if you don't renegotiate, you're not letting go of that child, and you're actually inhibiting the child's opportunity to grow. If the child gets out and doesn't figure out or doesn't have an experience that reveals something deep inside, they can be holding on to the introjected parents and keeping agreements that are actually choking their soul. It's interesting to me because if you think about it that way, you realize that the parents, once the children are gone, the parents have finished to some degree, it's never over, but to some degree that responsible parenting thing, and therefore they should be renegotiating their lives so that they can get closer to why they came to be and what they have to contribute to each other and to the world. I hope I'm making sense. That separation, which was the beginning of rites of passage, is a benefit to both the child or the children and the parents, because both are supposed to find their way back to the original agreement. And the original agreement of each soul is unique, but it is by its nature an agreement with the unseen or with the eternal, and therefore it causes us to want to find a connection to the eternal again. That inner sense of calling, inner sense of longing for something that transcends the limitations of fear and uncertainty and restriction is what the soul is here for. And that agreement is what we're trying to make. I'm suggesting not that it's easy to get back to that agreement, but if we want to not be caught in uncertainty and fear and depression and isolation, that's what gets us out of those things. And by its very nature, it connects us not just to the settled sense of center, but also to the creative possibilities of being. And we become then that person, like we're using Rumi right now, that person is full of expression. Rumi was sitting on the edge of the fountain until the book got out of his hands, and then he became the fountain. And that's an old image for the soul. It is a fountain trying to be opened so that it can flow expressively into the world. And I'm not saying that it's easy. I'm just saying that as the times get harder, more pressure, more uncertainty, more tragedy, and more darkness, the thing we're looking for is deep inside, and the process involves letting go of those things, agreements we made early in life, in order to get closer to the agreement our souls made before we came to life. Okay, so making a connection to the soul's original agreement often requires finding teachers and guides and practices. In other words, if we go back to Rumi, who became this amazing teacher and guide, he's still teaching and guiding because who he became has to do with the eternal. It persists throughout time. He's a guide to people right now, to many, many, many people. You don't have to have a teacher who's alive. You just have to have a teacher who's speaking to your soul. And so he's certainly one of those for many. But in ancient India, they would often use the Sanskrit term guru to identify a person who can offer spiritual insights and meaningful guidance. It's a beautiful idea. And the word itself is meaningful. I started out by saying the natural language of the soul is poetry. And language itself is a form of poetry. Words are alive, and words have hidden meanings. And the term guru is really interesting because gu, G-U, means darkness without light. Specifically, the darkness of ignorance and not knowing. And ru, R-U, means light without darkness, specifically the divine light of knowledge. So when you put the two parts together, you get the sense of a guru as someone who takes us from darkness to light, from a condition of not knowing to the light of genuine knowing, or what used to be called gnosis, G-N-O-S-I-S, not simple knowledge, but deep wisdom. And the implication is that a wise person knows both darkness and light and how to move from one to the other. I'm kind of retaking the idea of being in a dark time where the uncertainty is great and all. And the idea is not to get out of it, but to get deeper into it, because wisdom is darkness and light and the ability to move from one to the other. And of course, it turns out, if we go back to the cosmology we were talking about at the beginning, all of creation started in darkness, and the light of creation had to come out of that darkness, just the way the key that Nasruddin dropped can only be found in the darkness. And so when you find yourselves in very troubling times, it's like being at the beginning of creation again. And so then what we're looking for is methods and practices and arts and teachers who can be a guru to us. And that process of moving to darkness, from darkness to light, is also the process of moving from not knowing and the fears of the little self into the connection of the deep self. Those are, parallels. So the idea is not to avoid all the issues of darkness. It's rather to search for the light hidden within them. One of the old definitions of the human soul was the light hidden in darkness. And so the more we learn to penetrate our own darkness, address our own inner conflicts, the closer we get to the light inside, or the light that's called the soul, the light inside the darkness. And the more we do that, the more we have a sense of inner authenticity, and that gives us the sense of stability and centering that we need. We can't find centering in the outer world anymore. It's not there. It won't be there for a while. Besides, the real centering we're looking for is our own deep self-center. And just to repeat, when we find that, we get access to our own innate creativity as well. And so, just to say, this kind of wisdom that we need can come from a teacher and a guide as a living person. It can come from a long past person. It can come from a mythological figure. It can come from an animal. What awakens and seeks to guide us can appear in a specific teaching or practice, but also in a big dream or in a vision that comes from some unseen source. And this is especially true when we find ourselves living in the dark times. I'm saying it's painful to be in the dark times, but from the point of view of the soul, we're actually closer to awakening. We're actually closer to recognizing that we need a guru, a teacher, a practice. We need something that helps us or gives us better insights or helps us sustain a connection to that thing which is actually trying to awaken in ourselves. And anything that brings us from darkness and ignorance to light and genuine knowledge, we can say, is a guru for us. So I see there are questions. I'm in the process of discovering what it is within that needs to die in me at this time. My body is carrying me through a great deal of pain in order to get me more comfortable in a darker place where what's next hopefully will become available. I'm hoping that I will recognize the butterfly when it is released. Any words for maintaining patience during this phase? Yeah, I sympathized. The caterpillar has no idea that the butterfly is coming. That's the problem. Near as I can tell. The caterpillar doesn't go, oh my goodness, I get it. I'm in the darkness because I'm going to become a butterfly. No, the research says that the caterpillar cells are trying to kill the cells of the butterfly. So there's a part of ourselves that is in real pain and doesn't know or even want to let go of that. And so that's a kind of an acceptance. On one level, it's an acceptance of not knowing. On another level, and I find myself there repeatedly in the contemporary world, I see the tragedies going on. Right now, right as I'm saying it, I'm seeing the images I saw of the children starving in Gaza. I'm not talking about politics. I'm not talking about the different sides of whatever battle it is. I'm talking about, the children dying because of a confusion and history and all this kind of stuff that gets in the way. And that's not going to be solved tonight or tomorrow. And so part of us actually knows this period and this place where the pain is present and we have to be with it. But the idea from mythology, from imagination, is that pain can become labor pains. And if we stay with the pain, we can get closer to what's trying to be born from us. And the solutions that we need to solve the intractable, seemingly impossible to solve problems of the world are not going to come from committee meetings and great conferences. Some ideas might come out of that. But even then, it's going to come from the individual souls who are awakening from those states of pain and loss. That's what I would say. The butterfly doesn't know. I mean, the caterpillar doesn't know that the butterfly is coming. When they do the research on those, they find that it's two different cells, and it's like two beings in the same transforming body. And that's like the little self and the deep self. Our ego doesn't know at first that there is a deeper self and soul. And so the first step is realizing that this pain I'm feeling that feels overwhelming, I hear it as a voice that says, I can't handle this. That's the voice of the ego. And that ego, little self, needs to recognize through poems, through teachings, through practices, that there is a deeper self no matter who you are. And then the ego can loosen up, and then the pain shifts, the nature of the pain shifts, and eventually, according to all the old ideas, the little self begins to recognize the deep self more often, and eventually the ego or the little self becomes in service to the deeper self. And then that changes the language of the soul, the understanding of both pain and beauty, and it holds the seeds of both, the capacity to die a little and be born to a greater life. Will there be a day when the modern world and modern media, who are our so-called storytellers, can speak from this poetic ancient understanding? Modern society seems stuck in the left brain with old scripts and dimmed horizons. How do we bring this new language to the mainstream? Yeah, I mean, I'm with you. You wish you would hear, poetry in the news reports, because there's nothing in those news reports that can precisely enough identify the pain or in any way can help hold the pain. Typically, they are very linear and very distant from the notion of a poetic soul. But I don't think there's a way to quickly bring that to the mainstream. I don't know. The way I'm seeing it is that the change happens in the individual souls, and when it's happening to enough souls, it begins to then take a shape, and it begins to have enough then kind of penetration quality to enter, the collective life. I don't know that there's a simple way, or a way that in the near future can change the journalists into, some of them are storytellers. So you can look at it that way. You can find the ones that are actually uncovering the story. But I don't know. I don't know how long it's going to take to let the poetic stream enter the mainstream. Don't know. Speaking of the weight of the world, could you speak to the idea of integrating and embodying Atlas, and maybe also holding the tension of opposites between the Black Madonna, who seems to be presenting herself, especially recently, and the MAGA movement, and which archetype it would be associated with, maybe Mammon or Saturn? I think that's like a 42-week question there, or at least the answer would take a couple of moons to untangle. Let me just take the part that won't take too much translation. We're in the tension of the opposites in all kinds of ways. And so you experience them in different cultures in different ways. You have the increase of the wealthy class at great cost to the lower classes. The distance between that gets greater and greater, and that opposition gets more tense and more potentially dangerous. You have the tension between, the so-called liberals and the conservatives. What's happened is when the world shifts, and the collapsing of the institutions and all, then the underlying tensions of life become more manifest and more apparent. They've been there all along. People have talked about conservatives and liberals for decades, but they used to be connected and now they're not. And so we are in this tension of opposites. And the important thing to me about it is that the tension of the opposites is not there to divide and polarize. If we can hold the tension long enough, that tension is the tension of creativity. What's supposed to come from intensifying oppositions is not a third party or not a what do you call that, a kind of an accommodation or something. What's supposed to come out of it is creation. Remember, creation began with what was called darkness and chaos. And then from that came the light, and the tension between the light trying to, come out in the darkness is the energy of creation. And so, in a sense, we're in creation times again. So we can apply we can draw on all kinds of metaphorical and mythological figures because it's all through the stories of myth. But we can also just recognize that we are back in creation times. We have enough darkness that we could be, in total chaos. And yet the chaos is the prerequisite for the creation. So, we figure it out however we might. But the tensions of the opposite, that tension is going to increase. The world is not going to settle soon. The question is, can we find enough connection to the tension of opposites and hold it enough so it becomes a creative process, and therefore the world that's not yet here but is coming becomes a place of inclusion and interconnectedness and really humane values. And if it doesn't, then it just means we'll be in the tension longer. In other words, I'm saying from a mythological point of view especially, but also cosmologically, the world's not going to end. The question is what we do, how we act, what we can learn while it seems like it's going to end. I've been unwell for almost 5 years and getting more incapacitated. My soul work is making art, but I don't see how making art helps with these terrible times. Okay, thank you. Thank you for saying that. And it's true, and we know there's truth to that. That's a long time to be sick. I'm sorry for that and the incapacitation. But for me, I'd say keep making art. The making of art is not necessarily connected to the seeing of how it affects things. Let's say a painter paints this amazing painting, and they have a show, and they, it's one of the positions where they need to sell their own art in order to keep making art. Someone buys the piece of art, and it moves on into the world, and no one knows what happens. The artist has to let it go. And then that thing exists in the world. And so then the painting gets hung somewhere, and along comes a young person really struggling with what's going on, don't know, and they suddenly see that. You can see it. A person will stop in front of a painting, and something whole in that painting makes them feel whole in that moment. And all of a sudden their life is changing because of something painted by someone they will never see and never know. That happens. So I think there's something there about letting go. I don't know how that might affect the illness, but I think keep making art. The soul will be satisfied, and we don't know how what we make affects other people or somehow makes a small change in the world. Do you have an example of when the world out there was centered? Well, no, but I think there's times when it was more centered. I don't know. I just love old stories, and I love anthropological information too. And so when I'm studying, certain tribes and indigenous people that had old practices, I see it. I feel it. What comes to mind right away, I've been for years studying initiation and rites of passage and the mysteries processes, and all these initiation has so many forms. But to me, it's so beautiful because the idea is the initiate is never finished. The initiate means to begin. So if you're an initiate, you're always beginning. another phase, another step. And so that to me has been a great thing to even consider. And then I was trying to figure out, what's going on inside the process of initiation of rites of passage. And I found the tribe in Central Africa. And they say, when we're initiating the youth, we're awakening the wise elder in them. And when we're initiating the elders, we're reawakening the dream of life they had in their youth. And boy, I dropped the book. That's it. I'm just going to sit with that for a long time. And so I don't know. Did that operate in a meaningful way in the tribe? They knew it. They said it to someone. It's brilliant because what it tells you is that to be the initiate, to awaken to the nature of oneself, is to bring into connection the eternal youth in the soul and the wise old sage in the heart. Well, that creates a place of centered meaning. And so if they had that idea, if it was known in this tribe, it must have happened at some point. They must have known it. They must have experienced it. And that's just one little gem in the kind of, endless museum of things that people have done that have to do with this interesting combination of a genuine center that is also the beginning, because that's one of the old ideas in mythology. The center is the beginning. It's not that the beginning was back and the end is forward. Things begin each time the center is found again. So, I could probably name a whole series of things that I've studied and read about where people had a center. Here's a little one. So my ancestors on both sides are Irish, and the Irish have this mythology that says when everything is dark and everything's falling apart, because they had the notion of the center. They have like centers that were physical places, just like the Aboriginal people in Australia know that certain places are centers. And they had that knowledge. And then something would happen and then understanding of the center would fall apart. And so then they would say, so they had to know there was a center in order to know that it was missing. And they would say, and when everything falls apart, the thing to do, the guru advice, is that everybody turns to the place that looks darkest to them. And if each person would go to the place that looked darkest to them, like Nazar-ad-Din deciding to go into the darkness to look for the key, if each person would do that, each person would find a thread in the darkness that was compelling to them. And if each person took that thread, we'll call it the soul thread, you call it the genius thread, the thread of spirit. If each person were to take their thread and pull it back to the center, then the center would be recreated out of the individual threads of the souls who went into the darkness to find their own nature. They must have known something about the center. And so there's another example. I think I could keep going on that level, but I hope that helps. Also to say that out there is in here. When you find something meaningful, it resonates in both places. Is it possible to ignite the spark of goodness in another person and not only within ourselves? That's a beautiful question. It's a caring thing. I like it. And I would say yes, in the sense that spark can spark another spark, in the sense that we actually do that. We do that in love, and we do that in deep friendships. And so, yes. And we also do it in the mentor-student relationship. Shams did it with Rumi. Rumi did it with others. So it actually is a mutual ignition thing. And I think, yes, it's very possible. Now I'm saying, or I'm following this old idea that says change starts in the individual soul, and when enough individual souls awaken, that changes the collective group, and that's sparking from one to the other. And so when a person finds that spark, which according to many old imaginings is a speck of the original star, back to the original agreement and other things. And everybody has that speck of the original. Matter of fact, science agrees with that now. If the beginning of everything was a star that exploded, then everything that exists has some of that star in it. That's an old idea. The scientists rediscovered it. And so when a person is operating from the spark, a speck of star, divine spark inside them, they have an ability to spark or stimulate the spark that's in other people. That's literally, I think, what happens when I'm reading a poem or reciting a poem or telling a story. That's what happens. In the case of actually poets who were alive, their poetry, Rumi's a great example, there are many others, are still sparking the speck of star in other people. Yes, it is more than possible. It's necessary, and it could become more common. Would you share how you on a daily level work with and not get overwhelmed by the growing uncertainty in the world? Oh, okay. Well, that's challenging. No, it's a good question. I already mentioned, I go back to poetry. I go back to stories. For me, they are the threads that I can hold and touch and follow to a place of deeper center. And I'm the way I am. There's an really old story in India called The Witness Bird. And it's really one of those beginning stories, creation stories. And it says at the very beginning, there's two birds on a branch. I mean, it doesn't explain how the branch is there. It makes me think of the world tree. But anyway, and one bird is the bird that's about to sing, the bird that's about to act, and the other bird is the witness bird. And that the world begins with those two birds. So part of me feels like I have to witness the tragedy of the world. So I do. I read stories, I read the news, I watch the news, and I try to pay attention to the tragedy as a witness. And then I know that as soon as I do enough of that, I have to do something else in order to move the weight of that and in order to get out of the crushing nature of it. And so for me, that's stories, that's poetry. Sometimes it's just spontaneously singing to get some sense of harmony into the moment, listening to music, going out into nature. I will go from watching the news right out into the trees as if to reconnect with something that is not distorted or so threatening. And for me, that makes sense. I think we have to take some of the weight of what's going on, and in a certain sense, we have to be witnesses. But if we do that too much, then we become overwhelmed. And at times, I do become overwhelmed. I become, tragically damaged by taking in the stories of actual people or the stories of news reports. And then we have to go through some kind of recovery. But I think early on I was saying the issue is not to get out of the uncertainty, to avoid the uncertainty, avoid the darkness. The issue is to be in it in a way that allows us to find the light inside the dark, the center inside the uncertainty, and the creative inside the destructive. And so to me, that's an ongoing process that is different each day. And I think I started by saying, in a moment, I could make a long list of all the tragedies I'm aware of in the world. And then at the same time, if I stay in that, then I can lose my own sense of self and forget that I'm here to tell some stories, to read some poems, and also to sing. And so one of the things that I tend to do day after day is sing songs that I've learned, that mostly I've gotten from indigenous people, because there's something in the phrasing of it, mostly the vowels that are in it, that can cause a real change of self and a change of soul in a very brief time. And so since you asked that, instead of reading a poem, I'll sing a song. And so the question always is what song to sing. And in my case, several songs might come up at once, and that's what's happening right now. So, but I think I'll do this song. It's a Yoruba song. The essence of it is Mother Earth, hold us, for this world is hard. It goes like this. Ne ne you ya, ne ne you ya, aye yo, aye le, aye yo, aye shoru. Ne ne you ya, ne ne you ya, aye yo, aye le, aye yo, aye shoru. Ne ne you ya, ne ne you ya, aye yo, aye le, aye yo, aye shoru. Mother Earth, hold us, for this world is full of uncertainty and sorrow, of tragedy and loss. Mother Earth, hold us, for this world is hard. Thank you.